I did not wipe the wine off my ivory silk shirt. I let it dry like a signature she left on my fate. That woman thought she was putting someone beneath her in their place. By dawn, her empire learned a hard lesson. Humiliating the one holding the switch to $2.4 billion is costly. Yet, the scariest part was not the spill itself. It was the dozens of people who watched it happen and chose absolute silence. My name is Madeline Knight. At 38 years old, I have learned that true power never needs to announce itself. It simply waits in the room until the loud money makes a fatal mistake. That night, the mistake happened in a renovated historic train station in Denver. The venue was a cathedral of industry, boasting vaulted steel ceilings, draped in amber lighting, and echoing with the precise, sweeping notes of a string quartet. Waiters in pristine white coats glided across the original marble floors, carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar. It did not feel like a standard corporate fundraising gala. It felt like a coronation, a celebration of invincibility for people who firmly believed they owned the future, the crowning jewel of the evening. And the primary host of this extravagant display was Ashford Atlas Grid. They were a sprawling family-run conglomerate currently being hailed by the financial press as the ultimate savior of the American Southwest. Their pitch was undeniably seductive to desperate politicians and eager investors alike. They promised revolutionary anti-wildfire microgrid projects and massive electrical infrastructure upgrades across states that were choking on thick smoke and rolling blackouts every summer. To the politicians and executives sipping vintage wine beneath the steel arches, the Ashfords were visionary pioneers solving a generational crisis. To me, they were simply an asset on a ledger. I am the managing partner of Westmere Civic Capital, a fictitious-sounding name to the general public, but a terrifyingly real titan in the quiet world of private equity and infrastructure funding. I was the singular person possessing the sole authorization to unlock a critical funding package worth $2.4 billion. That specific money was the absolute lifeblood Ashford Atlas Grid required to survive their debt cycles and scale their operations. But I did not wear that staggering number on my sleeve, nor did I broadcast my executive title to the crowded room. I arrived at the gala entirely alone. I wore a finely tailored cream blazer over an ivory silk shirt, completely devoid of ostentatious designer logos. Pinned neatly to my lapel was a minimalist, standard-issue guest badge. There was no bustling entourage trailing behind me, no overly eager assistants whispering urgent updates into my ear, and no public relations team actively managing my social interactions. I grew up in Montana, raised in a tough, working-class family that spent their lives physically building and repairing the very high-tension electrical lines these wealthy executives now traded as abstract financial commodities. I knew the sharp metallic smell of ozone, the visceral danger of live wires, and the harsh reality of manual labor long before I ever sat at the head of a mahogany boardroom table. Perhaps that grounded history was exactly why I did not emit the desperate, pulsing frequency of someone seeking validation in a room like this. I did not need to be seen by them. I only needed to observe them in their natural habitat. That absolute stillness is exactly what drew Vanessa Ashford to me. She was the wife of the chief executive officer, Reed Ashford, and she navigated the crowded gala floor like an apex predator deeply accustomed to dominating a very specific, unforgiving ecosystem. In her highly insular world, a room operated strictly on the immediate currency of status signals. You were either a superior to be aggressively courted, a useful equal to be carefully managed, or a subordinate to be swiftly dismissed and discarded. I was standing quietly near the outer edge of the velvet-roped VIP reserve, casually holding a glass of sparkling water and taking a mental inventory of the shifting corporate dynamics playing out around me. I was entirely too calm for someone who, in her highly judgmental eyes, possessed absolutely no visible markers of extreme wealth or established corporate rank. Vanessa gracefully broke away from a tight circle of laughing local politicians and approached me. I watched her cold, calculating eyes perform a rapid, ruthless assessment of my worth. She took in the unbranded cream silk of my shirt, the deliberate lack of a blinding diamond tennis bracelet, the basic black and white print of my general admission badge. And finally, my polite, unbothered smile. In a mere fraction of a second, she reached her absolute verdict. I was a nobody, I was a minor vendor, a lowly contractor, or perhaps a mid-level manager who had strayed far beyond her designated boundaries. To Vanessa, I was trespassing in a sacred zone reserved exclusively for those holding genuine power and influence. What happened next was not an impulsive act of drunken rage. It was a cold, calculated execution of social hierarchy, meticulously designed to entertain her peers and firmly establish dominance. Vanessa casually signaled a passing waiter, her perfectly manicured fingers delicately lifting a full, heavy crystal glass of syrah from his polished silver tray. She turned her attention back to me, her lips curving into a perfectly hollow, predatory smile. She stepped deliberately into my personal space, aggressively invading the standard boundary of polite society. Then, without breaking eye contact, and with agonizing, deliberate slowness, she tilted the wine glass directly over my chest. The dark red liquid cascaded down in a thick, heavy stream, soaking instantly into the pristine cream silk of my blazer and shirt. The sudden chill of the wine sank right through the expensive fabric to my skin. It was not a clumsy bump. It was not a sudden stumble caused by a crowded, chaotic floor. It was a targeted, highly intentional pour. She tilted the crystal glass just slowly enough to ensure that everyone seated at the adjacent high roller tables understood perfectly that this was not a regrettable accident. It was a brutal sorting ritual. It was a self-appointed queen publicly reminding a perceived peasant to return to her rightful place in the dirt. The silence that radiated from our immediate corner was sudden, incredibly heavy, and completely suffocating. The sweeping notes of the string quartet seemed to fade entirely into the background. A woman dripping in heavy pearls to my left gasped loudly, her manicured hand flying to cover her mouth. Two older men in bespoke Italian suits offered nervous, highly awkward chuckles before abruptly turning their backs, suddenly pretending to be intensely fascinated by the historical steel architecture of the ceiling. A few other guests simply looked away, fixing their gazes firmly on the floorboards, cowardly refusing to make any eye contact with the victim of the social slaughter. Through the far periphery of my vision, cutting sharply through the awkward tension, I caught sight of Adrian Cole. He was the golden boy of the hour, the meticulously groomed and polished executive legally positioned to take over as the next chief executive officer of Ashford Atlas Grid. He was standing less than 10 feet away, gripping a glass of scotch. He saw the entire sequence of events unfold. He saw the deliberate, malicious tilt of the glass. He saw the dark red wine bloom across my pale chest like a fatal wound. His eyes met mine for one fleeting, panic-stricken second. But instead of intervening, instead of displaying the basic moral leadership his future title demanded, he deliberately shifted his weight backward, melting quietly into the shadows of a massive floral arrangement. The man destined to lead the future of this sprawling company witnessed outright abuse and actively chose the safety of silence over the career risk of standing up to the founder's powerful wife. I did not flinch. I did not step back, nor did I raise my voice to demand a frantic apology or create a theatrical scene for the onlookers. I simply stood my ground, feeling the damp, ruined fabric clinging uncomfortably to my ribs, and looked directly back into Vanessa Ashford's eyes. She fully expected me to shatter on impact. She expected hot tears, a flushed face of deep humiliation, a stammered retreat toward the public restrooms, or perhaps a hysterical outburst that would only further prove to the elegant room that I lacked the proper pedigree to belong among them. Instead, she found absolutely nothing. I looked at her not with boiling, irrational anger, but with the quiet, clinical, and terrifying satisfaction of an auditor who has just uncovered a massive, fatal discrepancy in a company ledger. I did not view this deeply humiliating moment as a personal attack. I viewed it as an invaluable piece of corporate intelligence. It was a behavioral data point entirely too perfect to waste. It took Reed Ashford exactly 18 seconds to realize what his wife had done and materialize breathless at the scene. The silver-haired chief executive officer rushed over, his aging face stretched into a tight, desperate mask of practiced damage control affability. He carried a white linen napkin, fluttering his hands in a frantic, theatrical display of distress that completely failed to reach the cold, calculating panic in his eyes. "Oh, my absolute apologies," Reed said, his voice projecting just loud enough to assure the wealthy onlookers that the situation was firmly under his capable control. "A terrible, unfortunate social misunderstanding. The crowds in these venues can be so overwhelmingly tight. Let us get you straight to the coat check, miss, and we will of course cover the cleaning bill." He reached out with the napkin, intending to dab frantically at my ruined shirt and physically usher me out of sight before the cameras noticed. I raised one hand, executing a single, sharp motion that stopped him dead in his tracks. The amber ambient light caught the dripping, deeply stained edge of my cream blazer. I looked from the trembling white napkin in his hand to the unapologetic, triumphant smirk still lingering securely on Vanessa's face. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, eagerly waiting for the humiliated woman to scurry away into the night. "I think I just learned exactly how your company measures human value," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried an absolute, undeniable authority. It cut through the remaining nervous murmurs and the clinking glasses with the heavy, icy precision of a falling guillotine blade. I did not wait for his flustered, corporate response. I did not wait for Vanessa's arrogant smirk to falter. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the grand exit, my posture perfectly straight, leaving a trail of dark red drops on the polished marble floor. They believed they had just successfully removed a minor, insignificant nuisance from their perfect evening. They had absolutely no idea who they had just poured their wine on, but by tomorrow morning, they would discover that this brief display of arrogance would not just stain a shirt, it was going to burn their entire empire to the ground. The heavy brass doors of the renovated station closed behind me, cutting off the symphony of strings and the nervous murmurs of Denver's elite. The crisp, biting night air hit my soaked chest, turning the spilled wine icy cold against my skin. The valet rushed forward, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second as he registered the dark, spreading stain on my cream blazer, but he kept his mouth shut and pulled my hired black sedan to the curb. I slid into the deep leather of the back seat. "Do not take me to the hotel yet," I told the driver. "Just park somewhere quiet. Keep the engine running." I did not care about the ruined silk. I did not care about the physical discomfort. The moment the car settled into a dark spot overlooking the city skyline, I pulled my encrypted tablet from my briefcase. The soft blue light of the screen illuminated the interior of the car. I bypassed the standard communications dashboard and went straight to the master legal files. I needed to cross-reference exactly what had just occurred with the specific ethics and risk control covenants buried deep within the master agreement. For the past 3 weeks, the financial press had been running victory laps for the Ashford family. Major business networks and leading industry blogs had already leaked the massive figure of $2.4 billion. The entire market operated under the absolute illusion that the deal was entirely finalized. Their stock had enjoyed a healthy bump, their vendors were breathing easier, and their competitors were quietly retreating. The public narrative was written in stone, but the public narrative was a lie. Westmere Civic Capital had not disbursed one single cent. The market loves a simple story of a wealthy savior cutting a massive check. But real infrastructure finance does not work like a retail transaction. This funding package was an intricate, highly sensitive, multi-layered structure. It was composed of direct infrastructure equity, heavily leveraged municipal credit guarantees, highly conditional local tax incentives, and most importantly, mandatory, ironclad governance conditions imposed on the senior leadership. The money was a loaded weapon, and the safety switch was entirely controlled by my signature. Until my pen hit the final execution page, the Ashfords were just playing with monopoly money in their heads. This was precisely why I had attended their lavish gala under a completely concealed guest profile. I deliberately bypassed my official executive invitation and utilized a blank +1 ticket provided by a minor vendor who owed my firm a favor. When you announce your arrival as the person holding the keys to the kingdom, every smile you receive is manufactured. Every handshake is mathematically calculated. I needed to witness the authentic power culture of Ashford Atlas Grid when they firmly believed no one of any actual consequence was watching them. I had learned this lesson the hard way exactly 2 years ago. During a different, highly lucrative acquisition, I had noticed a brief, seemingly insignificant moment of a chief executive officer casually belittling a junior logistics clerk. It was a fleeting sneer, a roll of the eyes, a deeply arrogant dismissal. I wrote it off as standard executive fatigue and pushed the deal through. That specific deal did not explode overnight. Instead, it suffered a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts. The toxic culture at the top trickled down, leading to massive employee turnover, hidden safety violations, and eventually, a devastating whistleblower lawsuit that bled our firm's reputation and capital for nearly 12 solid months. I swore I would never be professionally blinded by a balance sheet again. From that bitter experience, I engineered a highly specific, notoriously aggressive clause into every single master agreement Westmere Civic Capital drafted. Opposing legal teams constantly complained about it, calling it overly subjective and deeply annoying. It explicitly stated that the personal conduct of controlling parties and key executives, even entirely outside the official boardroom, could immediately trigger a complete withdrawal of capital if said behavior reflected a material governance risk or threatened the public integrity of the project. Sitting in the quiet hum of the idling car, I pulled up that exact clause on my screen. I highlighted the text. I did not view the incident back in that glittering hall as a matter of personal, emotional injury. My ego was not bruised. Rather, I viewed it as an absolutely perfect, unassailable stress test of their corporate culture, executing itself at the most critical hour possible, right before the massive safety net of our capital was deployed. Vanessa Ashford thought she was establishing dominance. What she had actually done was hand me a flawless, high-definition X-ray of the rot living inside her husband's empire. At exactly 11:45 that night, my private phone vibrated against the leather seat. The first piece of official correspondence from Ashford Atlas Grid had arrived. It was not a phone call from Reed Ashford himself, which would have shown at least a fraction of executive courage. Instead, it was an encrypted email sent by his chief of staff. I opened the message. It was a masterpiece of cowardly corporate spin. It spoke of regretting the unfortunate social friction and hoping the rest of my evening was pleasant. It casually mentioned the chaotic nature of large-scale fundraising events and offered to send a token gift basket to my office as a gesture of enduring goodwill. It was entirely vague, deliberately designed to lower the temperature of the situation without ever officially naming the atrocious behavior or accepting one single ounce of genuine responsibility. They were trying to sweep a structural failure under a rug of cheap public relations rhetoric. I locked the screen of my tablet and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I leaned back, staring out at the distant, glittering lights of the Denver skyline. My mind was perfectly clear, operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency of a perfectly balanced ledger. Tomorrow morning was the final, mandatory board meeting intended to execute the first massive tranche of funding. I made my decision right then and there. When the sun came up and I walked into their mahogany sanctuary, I was not going to waste a single breath arguing about high society etiquette or demanding a pathetic, forced flagy for a ruined silk shirt. I was going to force them to look down the barrel of a much larger, far more terrifying question. If this brutal, humiliating display was exactly how they chose to behave when they mistakenly thought the person standing in front of them possessed less value than a glass of spilled wine, how in the world would they treat our municipal partners, their frontline contractors, and our institutional shareholders when the heavy boardroom doors were tightly locked? "Take me to the hotel," I finally instructed the driver, my voice steady and devoid of any lingering adrenaline. "I need to get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a very expensive day for some people." As the car merged onto the empty highway, I mentally drafted the destruction of their false reality. They believed they were acquiring a massive financial lifeline at the exact hour the markets opened. They were entirely wrong. They were about to step into a meticulously constructed trap, built entirely out of their own unchecked arrogance. I entered the executive boardroom of Ashford Atlas Grid precisely at 8 in the morning. The space was a meticulously designed fortress of glass and polished mahogany, perched high on the 42nd floor, offering a commanding, panoramic view of the sun cresting over the rugged Rocky Mountains. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit over a pristine, high-collared white blouse. The ruined ivory silk from the night before had been discarded, but the undeniable evidence of its destruction walked into the room with me. Resting completely flat on the expansive table in front of my heavy leather chair was my encrypted tablet. It contained a locked, highly secure file holding 5 distinct, high-resolution photographs of the incident. My private intelligence team had sourced them directly from the social media feeds of careless gala attendees hours before the corporate public relations department could successfully scrub the internet. Reed Ashford sat at the absolute head of the massive table, flanked by his highest-ranking lieutenants. He possessed the glowing, artificially vibrant complexion of a man who firmly believed he was mere hours away from securing an untouchable, historic legacy. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from a silver carafe and called the meeting to order with a heavy, authoritative rap of his knuckles against the wood. "Gentlemen, and our distinguished guest from Westmere," Reed began, his deep baritone voice easily filling the cavernous room. "Today marks a truly historic moment for the future of Western infrastructure. We are finalizing a monumental strategic alignment built on decades of disciplined growth and absolute market confidence. This vital transition period, handing the daily operational reins to Adrian here, represents the ultimate evolution of our corporate vision. We are not just expanding a grid today. We are securing the energy future of an entire region," he continued for several minutes, weaving a dense, suffocating tapestry of corporate buzzwords. He spoke passionately of operational synergy, systemic resilience, and unprecedented shareholder value. He painted a flawless picture of a perfectly tuned machine ready to conquer the utility sector. He projected the absolute certainty of a man who thought the billions of dollars were already safely deposited in his corporate accounts. When he finally paused to take a confident sip of water, I leaned forward just enough to bring my shoulders into the direct center of his vision. "Before we move to the execution phase of the final documents," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of inflection, "I require exactly 3 minutes to formally address the event that occurred last night." Reed's practiced, charismatic smile did not completely slip, but it hardened noticeably at the edges. He waved a dismissive hand through the air, treating my statement like a buzzing insect that had briefly annoyed him. "Ah, yes, a regrettable social friction," Reed replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "The gala floor was incredibly chaotic, and the logistics were admittedly suboptimal. But let us maintain our professional focus. We certainly will not let a minor, unfortunate social misunderstanding delay a critical, multi-billion-dollar financial transaction. The broader mission is what truly matters." I did not look at Reed. Instead, I slowly shifted my gaze to Simon Vale, the chief financial officer. Simon was sitting rigidly exactly 2 chairs away from his boss. Unlike Reed, Simon did not look rested or victorious. The thin skin beneath his eyes was deeply bruised with exhaustion, and his knuckles were stark white as he gripped a heavy gold pen. Simon had not uttered a single syllable since I walked through the double doors. His silence possessed a terrifying gravitational weight. It was not the silence of agreement. It was the distinct, suffocating silence of a deeply terrified man who had actually read the master agreement. Simon knew the precise, unforgiving language of the morality and risk control covenants I had mandated. He understood the lethal architecture of my contracts. He knew this entire room, and by extension, the entire company, was currently balancing on the razor edge of a catastrophic cliff, and his chief executive officer was blindly tap-dancing right next to the drop. Sensing the sudden, dangerous dip in the room's atmospheric pressure, Adrian Cole cleared his throat, seated strategically to Reed's left. The golden boy leaned forward, deploying his best conciliatory tone. It was the exact, measured voice he used to soothe anxious institutional investors during turbulent quarters. "I completely understand the personal discomfort of the situation," Adrian said, offering me a look of highly manufactured, corporate empathy. However, it is vital that we compartmentalize our reactions today. We must not let a deeply personal situation overshadow our mutual strategic interests and the thousands of union jobs depending directly on this infrastructure expansion. I studied Adrian's perfectly symmetrical face. His attempt to play the pragmatic, reasonable peacemaker was highly revealing and ultimately fatal to his own character assessment. By deliberately labeling the unprovoked, public humiliation of a business partner as a mere personal situation, he accidentally exposed his core operational philosophy. When forced to choose between basic ethical principles and his own professional safety, Adrian would always choose safety. He was already actively protecting the toxic, abusive throne he so desperately hoped to inherit. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not immediately declare my ultimate authority over the Capitol. I simply tapped the dark screen of my tablet, bringing it to sudden, bright life, and asked a single, devastatingly simple question. Who in this room can articulate exactly why a similar incident will never happen when the cameras are off? The question hung suspended in the chilled air conditioning. It bypassed their heavily rehearsed public relations defenses entirely. It was not a question about apologies. It was a targeted, lethal strike at their internal governance. Reed bristled instantly, finally sensing a genuine, unmanageable threat to his absolute authority. He leaned aggressively over the mahogany table, dropping the affable statesman persona entirely. "You are completely misinterpreting the context of a private interaction," Reed snapped, his face flushing red. "You are an outsider judging intent without understanding the underlying dynamics of our operational sphere. My wife holds no official executive title. She is not on the payroll. Her actions, while perhaps poorly timed, have absolutely zero bearing on the structural integrity or the governance of this corporation." He was desperately trying to use complex, evasive language to shrink a massive, ugly reality. He truly believed he could outtalk a fundamental contractual breach by simply denying its relevance. I let his angry words echo and die in the vast, silent room. I waited exactly 4 seconds to ensure the absolute silence belonged entirely to me. I needed them to feel the precise moment the power dynamic permanently inverted. "You seem to be operating under a severe informational deficit regarding my role at this table," I said, my tone finally stripping away the last remaining layers of polite corporate courtesy. "I am not a junior compliance officer sent here to file a grievance. I am not a legal proxy standing in for a senior partner. I am the sole authorization signatory for the entirety of this capital package." The physical temperature in the boardroom seemed to plummet instantly. The aggressive color drained completely from Reed's face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified wax figure. Adrian stopped breathing, his mouth slightly open in shock. Simon Vale slowly closed his eyes, the gold pen finally slipping from his trembling fingers and clattering loudly against the polished wood. The sudden, crushing realization that they had publicly intentionally humiliated the single human being holding the absolute lifeline to their corporate survival hit them with the concussive force of a physical blow. Their arrogance had effectively written a check their balance sheet could not possibly cover. They waited in frozen terror for the execution. They waited for me to stand up, officially terminate the deal, and walk out the door, leaving their company to burn in the markets. But plunging a knife in immediately is a terrible waste of a perfect surgical opportunity. I did not withdraw the money. Instead, I established total, inescapable operational dominance over their entire executive structure. "The first tranche of funding is hereby formally suspended," I announced, my voice slicing cleanly through their collective panic. "I am enacting a mandatory pause on all capital disbursements. By 5 p.m. today, your internal legal department will provide my team with every single internal complaint, non-disclosure agreement, and unredacted human resources file related to the conduct of anyone within this company's control circle over the past 24 months. Reed opened his mouth to protest the massive invasion of his private empire, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He simply stared at me, completely paralyzed. If those files are not fully uploaded to my secure server by the deadline, or if my forensic auditors discover even a single missing page. I concluded, standing up slowly from my leather chair and buttoning my charcoal jacket. The deal is dead, and I will personally ensure the market knows exactly why the funds never arrived. Exactly 15 minutes before my mandated 5 o'clock deadline, my encrypted terminal chimed with a heavy, final digital tone. Simon Vale and the internal legal department of Ashford Atlas Grid had officially capitulated. They had unlocked the darkest, most heavily guarded filing cabinets of their corporate history and transmitted the contents directly into my possession. Watching the progress bar fill on my screen felt like watching a highly pressurized dam begin to crack. They had desperately hoped nobody with actual authority would ever demand to look inside these specific folders. I spent the next 3 hours dissecting the data with the clinical detachment of a forensic pathologist. The documents painted a horrifying, undeniable picture. Over the past 18 months, there had been 3 separate, highly detailed internal complaints. These were not minor grievances about workplace friction. They were formal cries for help from a logistics supplier, an external corporate event coordinator, and an independent structural consultant. Every single grievance shared an identical, terrifying common denominator. They all meticulously detailed instances where Vanessa Ashford had aggressively intervened in official company operations to verbally degrade and humiliate individuals she deemed to be of the incorrect social class. One report from the independent consultant described a vendor dinner where Vanessa explicitly demanded the woman be removed from the main table because her off-the-rack suit lowered the prestige of the evening. Another detailed a screaming match in a hotel lobby where the event coordinator was called a disposable servant in front of major municipal clients. The truly damning revelation, however, was not the abusive behavior itself. It was the sophisticated, highly illegal machinery constructed to hide it. As I cross-referenced these complaints with the massive due diligence files my team had reviewed weeks earlier, I found a gaping void. None of these severe behavioral risks had ever been reported to the open market. Absolutely nothing had been attached to the official risk assessment disclosures provided to Westmere Civic Capital. I followed the paper trail of the settlements, tracing the flow of hush money. The payments did not originate from the central corporate treasury. If they had, our preliminary audits would have easily flagged them. Instead, the legal team had drafted ironclad non-disclosure agreements and funded the financial settlements directly through the Ashford Civic Foundation, the family's ostensibly philanthropic charity arm. The implications of this discovery fundamentally altered the entire nature of the transaction. This was no longer a case of an isolated, unfortunate lapse in judgment by an arrogant spouse. This was a documented, systematically executed pattern of corporate concealment. The executives had weaponized a charitable foundation to actively suppress material risks from their investors. It was the exact definition of institutional fraud. As I was organizing the settlement ledgers, my private intelligence contractor sent an encrypted audio file to my secure inbox. It was a raw, unedited recording captured by a disgruntled catering server during the gala the previous night. The audio quality was slightly muffled by the clinking of heavy silverware and the ambient hum of the string quartet, but the voices were unmistakable. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and pressed play. Through the digital static, Vanessa Ashford's sharp, haughty voice cut clearly through the background noise. She was speaking to the terrified floor manager just moments before she approached me. "If she is a hired hand, teach her to stand in the right place," Vanessa commanded, her tone dripping with venomous entitlement. The audio clip was the final, lethal bullet. It obliterated any potential defense of accidental clumsiness or harmless social misunderstanding. My desk phone rang. It was Reed Ashford. His voice lacked the booming theatrical confidence he had wielded in the boardroom that morning. He sounded breathless, cornered, and increasingly desperate. He spent 10 agonizing minutes attempting to construct a firewall around his own position. He repeatedly pushed the utterly pathetic narrative that Vanessa was merely the wife of the chief executive officer, a private citizen who held no official title and drew no corporate salary. "Madeline, you must look at the actual organizational chart," Reed pleaded, his words tumbling over each other. "She has absolutely no operational authority. Her actions, while unfortunate, do not reflect the mechanics of the company. You cannot penalize thousands of hard-working employees for the private missteps of a spouse. I let him talk until he ran out of oxygen. I was beginning to suspect that Vanessa's influence ran significantly deeper than her purely social exterior suggested. A woman with no true authority does not command the legal department to bury her victims using charity funds. Reed was lying, and he knew I knew he was lying. I disconnected the call without offering him a single syllable of comfort. Less than 20 minutes later, my direct line rang again. This time, it was Simon Vale. The chief financial officer sounded like a man standing on the edge of a very tall building. The terrifying silence he had maintained in the boardroom had finally broken under the crushing weight of the financial reality he was managing. Simon did not attempt to defend the indefensible. Instead, he offered a partial, deeply dangerous confession. "We need that capital package to close this week," Simon said, his voice reduced to a harsh whisper, as if he feared the walls of his own office were listening. "It is not just about funding the new microgrid expansions. If the market senses any hesitation from Westmere, if our stock takes even a 5% hit, it is going to trigger a cascading chain of short-term debt covenants." I sat perfectly still, processing the magnitude of his admission. The glittering empire was a mirage. Ashford Atlas Grid was bleeding out internally. "You are over-leveraged," I stated simply, turning the horrifying truth into a plain, undeniable fact. "We have hundreds of millions in bridge loans that require strict market confidence to roll over," Simon confessed, the exhaustion practically radiating through the receiver. "We were banking on your $2.4 billion to restructure the immediate liabilities. If we do not announce the successful closure of the capital injection by Friday, our primary lenders are going to call their notes. We will face a massive liquidity crisis before the weekend." The entire picture finally snapped into absolute clarity. Ashford Atlas Grid was drastically weaker than the glossy financial magazines and the extravagant gala portrayed. They did not just want my money to boldly expand into the future. They desperately needed my money to prevent the market from seeing the massive structural cracks currently threatening to bring down their entire roof. I ended the call with Simon and leaned back in my chair, staring at the damning audio file and the fraudulent settlement ledgers illuminating my monitors. The pieces of the puzzle had locked together with terrifying precision. I finally understood that the arrogant act of pouring a glass of wine on a stranger was not the weapon that would destroy this company. The company was already critically ill, heavily mortgaged on false confidence and hidden sins. The spilled wine had simply grabbed the heavy velvet curtain and ripped it violently downward at the exact historical moment when Ashford Atlas Grid lacked the structural strength to survive even a minor scratch to its public reputation. They were a fragile house of cards, and they had just gleefully handed me the power to blow it all down. By noon, the crisis management machinery inside Ashford Atlas Grid had fully mobilized, desperately attempting to manufacture a sanitized reality. Reed Ashford and his elite public relations team realized they could not simply erase the event, so they decided to aggressively reframe it. They began circulating a carefully crafted narrative designed to transform a calculated act of cruelty into a mere logistical failure. The new official story claimed the VIP section had been improperly cordoned off. The guest flow was chaotic, and the floor layout was inherently flawed. They needed a sacrificial lamb to absorb the impact, and they quickly found one. Her name was Marisol Dean. She was the director of event coordination, a mid-level executive who had spent 6 years flawlessly executing corporate functions for the company. Marisol possessed an impeccable professional record, but she lacked the fundamental armor required to survive in a corporate war zone. She had no executive sponsor, no generational wealth to fall back on, and absolutely no leverage against the Ashford family. Reed was systematically preparing to terminate her employment, fully intending to offer her severed career to me as a symbolic apology. He believed throwing a subordinate to the wolves would perfectly satisfy my demand for accountability. I refused to let a working professional be slaughtered to protect an arrogant dynasty. While the internal public relations team was busy drafting Marisol's termination paperwork, I bypassed their curated narrative entirely. I ordered my legal analyst to legally compel the immediate transfer of all digital communications specifically related to the gala's logistics. I did not want the sanitized summaries. I demanded the raw data. I wanted the time-stamped emails containing the seating charts, the final approval chains for the guest lists, and the architectural routing maps for the venue. When the encrypted files arrived on my terminal, the digital fingerprints were undeniable. Marisol Dean had not failed at her job. Her original, highly organized logistical plans had been systematically dismantled and rewritten by an unauthorized party. Vanessa Ashford's personal email address appeared on dozens of direct messages sent to the event coordination team. The documents revealed that Vanessa had unilaterally altered the floor plans just 48 hours before the event. She had personally drafted notes crossing out specific names of regional managers, forcefully moving them to the back of the room. She had aggressively reorganized the seating arrangements around her husband, explicitly attaching a strict label that read, "Internal only to the groups of individuals legally permitted to stand within his immediate vicinity." She had meticulously engineered the very chaotic floor plan they were now attempting to blame on their event director. The digital forensic trail did not stop at the gala. Once my team identified Vanessa's email address as an active operational node, we ran a comprehensive search across the company's internal servers. We uncovered a chilling pattern of structural interference that completely obliterated the desperate defense Reed was actively utilizing. I opened an email dated exactly 7 months prior. It was a direct instruction from Vanessa to the vice president of procurement regarding an upcoming, highly sensitive dinner with a syndicate of investment bankers. Vanessa had demanded the immediate removal of a led female contractor from the guest list. Her written justification was not based on performance metrics or financial qualifications. Vanessa explicitly stated that the contractor needed to be excluded because she simply did not carry executive energy and would inevitably dilute the prestige of the evening. This single document was a lethal weapon. It conclusively proved that Vanessa was not merely an overbearing wife micromanaging social events. She was actively involved in dictating corporate access, shaping the public image of the executive branch, and directly interfering with crucial business partnerships. Despite possessing absolutely no official title, no salary, and no legal fiduciary duty, she was operating as a shadow executive with the unchecked power to quarantine contractors and dictate corporate strategy based entirely on her own vicious class prejudices. I possessed the ultimate leverage, yet I deliberately chose to keep this evidence hidden in my digital vault. I did not immediately march into the boardroom and slam the printed emails onto the mahogany table. I needed Reed to firmly lock his own traps. Throughout the early afternoon, I allowed him to continue speaking on the official corporate record. Every time my legal team held a procedural check-in with his executives, Reed stubbornly repeated his primary defense. He repeatedly stated that his wife was a private citizen who operated entirely outside the corporate structure. He insisted her actions were strictly personal and isolated. Every single time he uttered those words into the official minutes, he unknowingly tightened the legal noose around his own neck. He was committing documented perjury regarding the operational governance of a publicly traded entity. While the executives remained barricaded inside their glass fortress attempting to spin the narrative, the brutal reality of the financial markets began to aggressively close in around them. In the ruthless world of high finance, a delayed transaction is never a secret. The sudden, unexplained pause on our $2.4 billion disbursement acted like blood in the water. The rumors rapidly breached the walls of the boardroom and cascaded down into the broader financial ecosystem. The auxiliary banks, the institutions holding the massive short-term bridge loans that kept Ashford Atlas Grid afloat, noticed the sudden silence. The scheduled press releases announcing our capital injection never materialized. By 2 p.m, Simon Vale's phone began to ring incessantly. The syndicated lenders were calling in a state of escalating panic. They demanded immediate verification that our firm's governance certifications were still valid. They wanted to know why the money had not crossed the wire. They were aggressively inquiring if a material breach of contract had occurred overnight. I watched the chaos unfold from the quiet sanctuary of my temporary office. Simon was completely trapped in a deadly crossfire. On one side stood his patriarchal, fiercely proud chief executive officer, a man utterly obsessed with maintaining his family's flawless image and actively demanding the suppression of the truth. On the other side stood the terrifying, undeniable reality that the company was rapidly running out of oxygen. The market was knocking on the door, and Simon knew they possessed absolutely zero margin for error. If he lied to the lenders to protect Reed, he would be personally committing securities fraud. If he told the lenders the truth, the stock would instantly collapse, triggering the debt covenants and bankrupting the firm by Friday. The pressure inside the executive suite was reaching a catastrophic boiling point. They were frantically searching for a way to appease me, still operating under the pathetic delusion that this was a simple negotiation of terms. They thought they could offer me a minor concession, fire a scapegoat, and return to their scheduled victory lap. At exactly 4 in the afternoon, I decided to finally strip away their remaining illusions. I did not send a lengthy legal demand. I did not request another face-to-face meeting to debate the semantics of social behavior. I composed a single, devastatingly precise message and transmitted it directly to the personal devices of every single board member, completely bypassing Reed's protective chief of staff. The message read, "I am not looking for someone to blame. I am determining which of you knew about this beforehand." That single sentence fundamentally shifted the battlefield. It was no longer a question of whether the company would be punished for a spilled glass of wine. It was a formal declaration of an internal witch hunt. I was forcing every executive and board member to look around the room and calculate their own personal liability. I was not just targeting the king and his queen. I was actively hunting for the architects who built their abusive throne. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, my encrypted phone vibrated with an incoming message from an unregistered number. It was Adrian Cole. He urgently requested a private, face-to-face meeting, explicitly asking to convene far away from the polished mahogany and hidden security cameras of the corporate headquarters. He had secured an anonymous hourly rental conference space in a sterile, low-tier business center downtown. The room was essentially a suspended glass box jutting out over the dark, rushing water of the river. I arrived precisely on time to find him already waiting inside. He had intentionally left the harsh fluorescent overhead lights switched off. The only illumination in the suffocatingly small room came from the ambient, scattered glow of the city skyline bleeding through the window panes. Against the sheer glass overlooking the black water, Adrian's reflection was superimposed over the turbulent current. In that ghostly projection, his face looked deeply hollowed out, carrying a profound structural exhaustion that makeup and tailored suits could no longer hide. The vibrant, endlessly confident golden boy of the infrastructure sector had completely evaporated. In his place sat a terrified man who had finally realized his entire magnificent career was built directly over a massive Ativaev fault line. I took the cheap plastic chair opposite him, placing my leather bag on the scuffed laminate table. I did not offer a greeting. I simply waited, allowing the heavy silence of the room to press down on his fractured nerves. "I saw exactly what happened," Adrian began, his voice lacking any of the measured baritone projection he utilized during shareholder calls. He stared intensely at his own tightly clasped hands. I saw her pick up the glass. I saw the absolute intent in her eyes. I knew it was a catastrophic violation the very second she tilted her wrist. He stopped, taking a jagged breath, desperately hoping I would offer a sympathetic nod or a soft word of understanding to ease his conscience. I offered him absolutely nothing. I remained perfectly still, my expression a blank, unreadable wall. "I did not step forward," he continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The official board vote to permanently install me as the chief executive officer is scheduled for the end of this month. I have spent 5 years navigating the unbelievable toxicity of that family, absorbing their blows, waiting for my absolute turn at the wheel. I convinced myself that causing a public scene, that clashing openly with Reed over his wife's psychotic behavior would jeopardize my ability to enact genuine, sweeping reform once I finally held the gavel. I told myself I was protecting the greater good of the company. It was the classic, pathetic rationalization of the corporate enabler. He truly believed he was a decent, highly principled person who had simply been forced into an indecent compromise. He wanted me to absolve him, to validate the heavy burden of his ambition. I did not forgive him. I did not cross the city in the dark to act as his priest. I listened with cold satia. Clinical precision, because the intricate mechanics of a successor's cowardice often expose far deeper, more fatal structural flaws than the blatant arrogance of the primary aggressor. If the handpicked future of the company was too paralyzed by fear to intervene over a spilled drink, the entire foundation of their leadership was irrevocably rotten. Adrian reached into his leather briefcase with trembling fingers and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He slid it slowly across the table. It lacked any official corporate letterhead. These were the deeply buried secrets, the foundational cracks he had actively helped conceal. I broke the seal and pulled out the top document, holding it up to catch the dim light from the window. It was a set of highly classified, internal minutes from the Executive Risk Subcommittee, dated exactly 6 months prior. The transcript detailed a fiercely tense exchange behind closed doors. Simon Vale, the deeply stressed chief financial officer, had explicitly warned the core leadership about the escalating threat of Vanessa Ashford. Simon had stated, on the permanent record, that the constant, unchecked involvement of the family in external-facing operations, vendor management, and partner relations possessed the severe potential to completely invalidate their ethical compliance certifications with institutional investors. He had essentially drawn a map straight to the explosion that was currently leveling their company. I scanned down the page to read Reed's documented response. The chief executive officer had aggressively shut Simon down, physically striking the warning from the official board summary. Reed had casually and arrogantly dismissed the chief financial officer's existential dread, officially categorizing the warning as overly sensitive lawyer language. He consciously and deliberately permitted Vanessa to continue operating as an invisible, untethered center of gravity. A rogue moon pulling the corporate tides without answering to any legal or ethical oversight. As I absorbed the full weight of these documents, a much colder, vastly more cynical reality snapped into terrifying focus. I looked up from the pages and studied Adrian's defeated posture. For the past 12 months, the financial press had breathlessly praised his imminent promotion as a bold, modernizing reform for the aging infrastructure giant. The market actively loved him because he projected clean, progressive corporate governance. But holding these hidden minutes, the ultimate soft betrayal revealed itself. Adrian was never intended to actually govern. He was nothing more than a highly marketable illusion. He was a fresh, incredibly expensive coat of paint applied thickly over a deeply decaying structure to fool the inspectors. The true, absolute power was never going to leave the immediate Ashford family circle. Adrian had been brought in to placate the nervous market, a decorative hood ornament on a heavy vehicle still entirely driven by Reed and Vanessa. They were going to let him hold the title and absorb the public liability. While they continued to manage the empire from the shadows, the entire succession plan was a massive, carefully orchestrated lie. If that capital package does not return to the escrow accounts by tomorrow, we are completely dead, Adrian said, his voice dropping to a desperate, ragged whisper. He was no longer talking about his own ascension. The illusion of his power had been utterly shattered, leaving behind only the sheer terror of a man watching the walls collapse. The bridge lenders are actively circling, he explained, his eyes wide and unblinking. If they declare a technical default on our short-term obligations, we will face a massive, unpayable margin call overnight. Our outstanding debt will be brutally reassessed by the ratings agencies before dawn. By the time the opening bell rings tomorrow morning, our stock price will be absolutely crushed. The equity will be wiped out. The company will be stripped and sold for spare parts by the restructuring firms. He spoke with the frantic, pleading cadence of a man begging for the physical survival of the institution. He was practically offering up Reed's head on a silver platter, hoping the sacrifice of his mentor would somehow quench the fire I had deliberately allowed to spread. He thought surrendering these documents proved he was finally stepping out of the shadows, proving he possessed the moral clarity to lead. He was entirely wrong. Delivering the evidence of a crime only after the building is surrounded by police does not make you a hero. It merely makes you a highly cooperative hostage. I slowly and meticulously slid the heavily classified documents back into the manila envelope. The ambient light from the river cast long, sharp shadows across the cheap table, cutting the room into fragments of dark and light. Adrian leaned forward, searching my face with desperate intensity for any sign of leniency, any minor indication that his 11th hour betrayal of his tyrannical boss had bought him a personal reprieve from the slaughter. I stood up, smoothly adjusting the lapels of my dark coat. I looked down at the exhausted, broken man who had willingly traded his own spine for a prestigious title he would never truly own. I needed him to understand that he could no longer occupy the safe, comfortable middle ground between complicity and consequence. Silence for ambition is still silence, I told him. My voice was perfectly level, devoid of any anger or sympathy, cleanly stripping away his final, desperate psychological defense. And the market does not price intent. It prices consequences. Reed Ashford was a cornered animal, and cornered corporate animals always rely on their most primitive, deeply ingrained survival instincts. By 8 o'clock the following morning, his boutique crisis communications firm had quietly deployed a ruthless shadow campaign. Reed realized he could not fight me on the strict contractual terms of the master agreement, so he actively attempted to assassinate my professional objectivity. Blind items and strategically placed leaks began to surface across prominent financial blogs and heavily circulated industry newsletters. The narrative was meticulously spun to favor the incumbent power. The anonymous sources quoted in these publications claimed that a certain aggressive, unnamed infrastructure fund manager was purposely personalizing a minor social clash to extort favorable concessions at the negotiating table. They painted a picture of a hysterical, ego-driven executive weaponizing a trivial faux pas to artificially lower the valuation of a proud, legacy American company. Several prominent financial pundits took the bait immediately. Opinion pieces began to argue that treating a spilled drink as a material breach of corporate governance was a terrifying overreach of private equity power. Reed fundamentally believed that if he could successfully drag the entire conversation into the murky, subjective waters of an emotional grievance, he could effectively blind the broader market to the massive structural decay I had uncovered. He genuinely thought he only needed to win a war of attrition in the court of public opinion to force my hand. He severely miscalculated the internal rot of his own empire. The fatal blow that morning did not come from my aggressive legal team, nor did it come from the hostile financial press. It came directly from the woman who had spent the last 7 years quietly cleaning up the bloody, toxic messes left behind by the Ashford family. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, Tessa Lyle, the global head of human resources, committed ultimate corporate treason against her chief executive officer. She was completely exhausted. Tessa had spent nearly a decade acting as a highly paid janitor for a family that treated their publicly traded corporate charter like a private, untouchable feudal kingdom. She had personally watched brilliant female engineers get aggressively sidelined from lucrative municipal projects simply because Vanessa Ashford found their wardrobe uninspiring. Tessa had finally reached the absolute breaking point of her own moral elasticity. Without issuing a single warning to the executive suite, Tessa bypassed Reed entirely and transmitted a sworn, legally binding affidavit directly to the secure inboxes of every single independent member of the board of directors. I received a blind copy directly to my encrypted tablet. Her affidavit was a masterpiece of lethal, bureaucratic precision. Tessa explicitly confirmed that Vanessa possessed unauthorized, direct access to the highest levels of the corporate machinery. The document detailed 4 separate, highly specific instances where Vanessa had aggressively bypassed human resources approval chains to unilaterally alter executive guest lists. Tessa meticulously documented how the founder's wife routinely demanded the immediate removal of high-performing women from critical negotiation tables because she declared they did not project the correct pedigree for high-level commerce. Most damning of all, Tessa verified under penalty of perjury that the exact degrading classist language used at the gala was not a one-time slip of the tongue. It was a documented historical pattern of systemic abuse that Reed had repeatedly and explicitly ordered the Human Resources Department to ignore and bury. Tessa did not just provide written testimony to the stunned board members, she attached a secondary, digitally enhanced audio file of the gala incident. The catering staff had not just captured one muffled cell phone recording. The venue's ambient security microphones, situated directly above the VIP section, had caught the entire exchange with terrifying, crystalline clarity. Simon Vale heard the enhanced audio during a frantic, impromptu huddle in the heavily fortified legal department. I was informed later that the chief financial officer physically slumped against the frosted glass wall when the playback finished. In this pristine, unfiltered version, the background strings of the quartet faded away, isolating Vanessa's sharp voice perfectly. There was absolutely no background chatter to blur her malicious intent. The sheer, unapologetic arrogance as she ordered the floor manager to physically teach a hired hand to stand in the correct place was completely undeniable. Simon instantly realized their primary defensive strategy was completely dead. The company could no longer hide behind the pathetic shield of a misunderstood context. The audio violently murdered any possibility of categorizing the event as an unfortunate, clumsy accident. Any independent auditor, any compliance officer, and any federal regulator who heard that specific recording would immediately classify the entire senior leadership as a massive, unmitigated liability. The financial market is a highly sensitive, deeply paranoid organism. It does not require a viral, globally trending video to register a fatal corporate disease. It only requires the right people in the right rooms to catch the subtle scent of panic. Within hours of the independent board members receiving Tessa's sworn affidavit, the whispers began to circulate through the heavy oak doors of the syndicated banks. The primary lenders holding the massive short-term debt did not even need to hear the actual audio clip to react. They only needed to know that a certified pattern of materially relevant, actively concealed executive misconduct existed, and that Westmere Civic Capital had found it and subsequently halted all funding. The abstract concept of institutional trust began to evaporate into thin air. Bond yields started to quietly spike. Risk analysts at the major funds began quietly downgrading their short-term outlooks on the stock. The massive weight of their hidden debt was beginning to critically fracture the thin ice beneath their feet. Inside the glass walls of the headquarters, the board of directors rapidly fractured into two violently opposed factions. The screaming matches echoed down the executive hallways. The old guard, deeply loyal to the Ashford dynasty and terrified of immediate public embarrassment, desperately wanted to close ranks. They aggressively argued for massive, immediate financial settlements, hoping to weather the storm by simply throwing millions of dollars at the problem to protect Reed at all costs. The second faction, comprised primarily of the newer, independent directors who actually understood regulatory compliance, looked at the plummeting pre-market indicators and realized the absolute opposite. They finally understood that protecting the chief executive officer was no longer an act of loyalty. It was a guaranteed suicide pact. They loudly argued that keeping Reed in the center seat was the fastest, most efficient method to completely vaporize the remaining value of the entire corporation. Throughout this entire chaotic, blood-soaked day, my private phone rang endlessly with urgent inquiries from major financial news networks. They all wanted the exclusive scoop. They desperately wanted an angry, vindictive quote from the woman who was holding $2.4 billion hostage over a stained silk shirt. I declined every single request for comment. I did not issue a self-righteous press release. I did not hire my own crisis firm to leak a counter-narrative. I maintained a wall of absolute, impenetrable silence. My controlled silence was far more terrifying to the warring factions inside the Ashford boardroom than any public accusation I could have ever made. As the hours ticked by, the executive slowly realized that I was not fighting a shallow public relations war. I did not need a temporary emotional victory on the front page of a newspaper. I only cared about the exact mathematical execution of my contractual rights and the perfect timing of the kill. The truth was fully exposed, the board was tearing itself apart, and the massive pool of capital remained tightly locked away in my accounts. I had handed them the rope, and I was comfortably sitting back in the shadows, watching them frantically tie the knot themselves. The clock on the wall of the executive boardroom read 11:45 at night. The panoramic view of Denver was now a sea of dark glass and scattered amber streetlights. Inside the 42nd floor fortress, the atmosphere had degraded from tense professionalism into raw, unfiltered panic. The board of directors of Ashford Atlas Grid was locked in a mandatory emergency session that was guaranteed to stretch until dawn. They were trapped in a brutal race against the sun. If they failed to produce a definitive, legally binding resolution before the market opened the following morning, the major credit rating agencies were poised to issue a catastrophic downgrade. A downgrade would instantly vaporize their ability to roll over their short-term debt, triggering an immediate and fatal liquidity crisis. I did not enter the room to beg for their compliance, nor did I raise my voice to issue theatrical threats. When I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors exactly 10 minutes before midnight, the arguing voices abruptly died. The air was thick with the smell of stale black coffee and the sharp tang of nervous sweat. Highly paid executives sat with their ties loosened and their sleeves rolled up, looking like hostages waiting for a ransom demand. I walked directly to the empty seat at the opposite end of the long table from Reed Ashford. I did not sit down. I placed a single, crisp sheet of heavy white paper on the polished wood. It contained 5 non-negotiable stipulations required to restore our capital review process. It was not a discussion draft. It was the exact price of their survival. "You have precisely 9 hours until the opening bell rings," I stated, my voice echoing cleanly in the vast room. "I am providing you with the only existing roadmap to prevent the total liquidation of this company. This is a binary choice. You will execute all 5 of these conditions in their entirety, or the funding is permanently revoked." I did not wait for their legal counsel to interject. I began reading the stipulations with the cold, rhythmic cadence of a metronome. "Condition 1, I began, locking eyes with the chief executive officer. "Reed Ashford will resign from all executive duties and surrender his seat on this board immediately. This transition of power must be formally filed with the Regulatory Commission before 9:30 in the morning." A collective gasp rippled down the length of the table. Reed's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson, his jaw clenching so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. "Condition 2, I continued smoothly, ignoring the rising temperature in the room. "Vanessa Ashford is permanently prohibited from attending, influencing, or participating in any corporate activities. This includes, but is strictly not limited to, investor relations, vendor selection, public relations events, and strategic partnerships. She will be legally and physically barred from all company premises. Her nameless, untethered authority ends tonight." I watched the independent directors closely. A few of them instinctively nodded, finally recognizing that cutting off the toxic shadow power was the only way to amputate the infection spreading through their ranks. "Condition 3, I stated, my tone hardening. "The executive branch will immediately surrender all concealed documents to the independent board members. This includes every single non-disclosure agreement, all financial settlement ledgers, and every internal email related to the behavioral complaints that were purposefully omitted from the original risk disclosures." Simon Vale stared at the floor, knowing perfectly well that Condition 3 would completely expose his own complicity in the cover-up. "Condition 4, I said, shifting my gaze to the exhausted, pale face of the heir apparent. "Adrian Cole will only be considered for the position of interim leader under one absolute constraint. He must sign a binding, personal certification guaranteeing that he will not tolerate, enable, or protect any form of nepotism or shadow governance. If he fails to enforce this, He will be personally liable for the resulting breach of contract. Adrian swallowed hard, the weight of the demand visibly pressing down on his shoulders. He was being forced to legally chain himself to the mast of a sinking ship, completely severing his protective ties to the founding family. And finally, Condition 5, I concluded, delivering the ultimate structural blow. An immediate independent audit focusing on corporate culture and external controls will be launched at dawn. This auditing firm must be selected by Westmere Civic Capital, and they will be granted unrestricted, unredacted access to the financial records of the Ashford Civic Foundation. The room erupted. The mention of the family charity was the absolute limit. Reed slammed his heavy palms onto the table, pushing himself to his feet. His chair screeched violently against the hardwood floor. "This is an illegal corporate coup," Reed roared, pointing a trembling finger across the length of the room. "You are using a manufactured social grievance to execute a hostile takeover of my family's legacy. You have absolutely no legal right to demand access to a private philanthropic foundation. When you weaponize that private philanthropic foundation to secretly pay off the victims of your wife's abuse, you fundamentally merged it with your corporate liabilities," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet, cutting perfectly through his booming outrage. "You used tax-exempt charity funds to commit institutional fraud and deceive your investors. I am not executing a coup. Reed, I am pricing your risk." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The independent board members, the men and women who possessed genuine fiduciary responsibilities to the shareholders, were no longer looking at me with hostility. They were looking at the single sheet of paper with the grim, desperate realization of soldiers who have just been handed the terms of their own surrender. They finally understood that my demands were not an arrogant display of private equity power. They were a meticulously calculated invoice for the years of arrogance, abuse, and financial deception this company had allowed to flourish. I turned away from the table and walked slowly toward the heavy mahogany doors. I paused with my hand on the brass handle, looking back at the fractured, terrified leadership of Ashford Atlas Grid. "I will expect your fully executed signatures delivered to my secure server by 8 o'clock in the morning," I told them. "If I do not receive them, I suggest you advise your families to sell their equity before the market opens." I walked out into the quiet, dimly lit hallway, leaving them locked inside their glass cage to tear each other apart. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind me, the most terrifying realization of the entire night settled into my mind. I had just offered them a perfectly viable, logical path to salvation. I had provided the exact blueprint required to save thousands of jobs, rescue their critical infrastructure projects, and preserve a fraction of their corporate dignity. Yet, despite the overwhelming, undeniable math staring him directly in the face, Reed Ashford was still standing at the head of that table. He was still puffing out his chest, utterly consumed by his own monumental hubris. The truly frightening reality was that even with a clear, illuminated exit sign glowing brightly in the dark, the king still firmly believed he possessed enough power to simply refuse to walk through the door. It was exactly 5:45 in the morning. The massive glass walls of the executive boardroom offered a perfectly unobstructed view of the Denver skyline, but there was no light yet. The sky remained a heavy, bruised purple, pressing down on the city like a suffocating blanket. Inside the 42nd floor fortress, the air conditioning hummed with a cold, mechanical drone that completely failed to cool the sweating. Terrified men seated around the mahogany table. The remaining executives looked like hollowed-out ghosts of the titans they pretended to be. Their custom Italian suits were deeply wrinkled. Their ties were violently loosened or discarded entirely. Their eyes were bloodshot and darting. We were dialed into a secure, highly encrypted, and legally mandated conference call with the lead syndicate lenders. These were the apex predators of the financial ecosystem. The bankers in New York were fully awake. They were aggressively watching their illuminated terminals. They were watching the short-term debt limits of Ashford Atlas Grid violently tremble and fracture, because I had forcefully choked off the first massive tranche of our infrastructure funding. Reed Ashford refused to surrender the microphone. A rational, competent chief executive officer facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis would have immediately yielded the floor to the chief financial officer or the head of the legal department. Reed did neither of those things. He gripped the polished edge of the table with white-knuckle intensity. He leaned his heavy frame aggressively toward the central speaker console. He was operating under the deeply dangerous, incredibly antiquated delusion that a commanding baritone voice and sheer, unfiltered patriarchal confidence could magically bend the institutional financial markets back to his absolute will. He spoke rapidly of temporary, unforeseen logistical delays. He used complex, meaningless corporate jargon about administrative recalibrations and minor compliance verifications. He projected the absolute hollow certainty of a desperate gambler pushing his final borrowed chips into the center of the table. He truly believed that if he just sounded strong enough, the market would simply close its eyes and trust him one more time. The lead credit risk officer from the primary investment bank abruptly cut through Reed's frantic monologue. The banker's voice was flat, metallic, and utterly devoid of human emotion over the high-fidelity speakerphone. The question he asked was not a request for clarification. It was a surgical scalpel aimed directly at the jugular vein of the corporation. The banker asked if there existed any undisclosed chain of behavioral incidents, any hidden legal liabilities, or any suppressed formal human resources complaints related to any specific individual holding a controlling influence over the daily operations of the company. Before Reed could even inhale, the banker stated with chilling clarity that the current call was being permanently recorded for strict federal compliance purposes. The entire boardroom stopped breathing. The ultimate trap had finally been sprung. Reed Ashford had exactly 1 single second to save his own life. He had one fleeting moment to admit the catastrophic structural failure, to beg the syndicate for a temporary grace period, and to promise a complete, transparent overhaul of his executive branch. He did not take it. His arrogance was a terminal disease. He leaned even closer to the microphone. He did not blink. He did not look at his legal counsel. "No material pattern exists," Reed stated. His voice was perfectly steady. It was the ultimate, legally binding lie. It was a massive, documented act of securities fraud broadcast directly into the ears of the institutions holding the absolute power to bankrupt him. I sat quietly in the darkest corner of the vast room. I was dialed into the exact same secure conference line from my encrypted tablet. I possessed the immediate power to unmute my microphone, interrupt the call, and destroy him on the spot with the evidence in my briefcase. I deliberately chose not to. I let the suffocating silence hang in the chilled, sterile air of the boardroom. I waited. 1 second passed. 2 seconds passed. 3 agonizing seconds ticked by. I needed that specific, fraudulent sentence to permanently burn itself onto the federal compliance servers in New York. I needed the concrete to completely dry around his ankles before the water was turned on. That single, arrogant lie could have theoretically saved Reed, but only if the room had been entirely empty. But the room wasn't empty. Simon Vale was sitting exactly 3 seats away from the chief executive officer. The chief financial officer looked physically ill. His skin was the color of wet ash, and his hands were trembling violently. Spread wide open across the polished wood, directly in front of him was the massive, damning dossier I had forced him to surrender the previous afternoon. It was the thick stack of buried human resources complaints, the suppressed legal warnings, and the heavily redacted charity fund wire transfers. These were the exact files that had kept him violently awake all night, staring at the ceiling and calculating his own prison sentence. Simon was an accountant, a man who lived and died by the absolute truth of the ledger. He was currently looking down the barrel of a federal indictment. If he allowed Reed's blatant lie to stand unchallenged on a federally recorded line, Simon would instantly transform from a passive, terrified witness into an active primary co-conspirator to massive institutional fraud. His professional loyalty to the Ashford family finally shattered under the crushing weight of his own self-preservation. Simon reached out with a violently shaking hand. He pressed the brightly illuminated red button on his own microphone console. "That is factually incorrect," Simon said. His voice cracked, weak and terrified, but the words successfully breached the silence of the call. Reed snapped his head toward his chief financial officer, his eyes wide with absolute, uncomprehending shock. There are multiple, severe internal complaints, Simon continued, speaking rapidly and breathlessly into the microphone before Reed could physically reach over and silence him. There are several undocumented financial settlements that bypass the central treasury. There are active, highly documented, and subsequently ignored internal warnings regarding severe executive conduct that were purposefully excluded from the risk certification matrices provided to our investors. Reed stared at Simon. It was a look of pure, venomous, unfiltered betrayal. Reed's fists were clenched so tightly, his fingernails dug deeply into his own palms. He looked entirely ready to lunge across the table and commit physical violence. But that specific, violent glare was exactly what the remaining independent board members in the room desperately needed to witness. Reed did not look horrified or ashamed that his company was deeply corrupt. He looked absolutely furious that his corruption had been spoken aloud. He viewed the unvarnished truth as an act of profound treason. He did not view the systemic, years-long concealment of abuse as the actual poison killing his empire. In that singular fraction of a second, the independent board, finally, completely understood the terrifying reality. Reed Ashford was utterly incapable of reform because he fundamentally believed he was above the law. The silence that followed Simon's frantic confession was absolute, paralyzing terror. Then, another voice finally broke the stillness. It was Adrian Cole. The golden boy of the infrastructure sector had been paralyzed by his own ambition and cowardice for years. He had sat silently in the shadows, actively tolerating the abuse, waiting patiently for his guaranteed turn upon the throne. But watching the ship actively strike the iceberg, watching the chief financial officer confess to federal crimes on a recorded line, finally triggered his dormant survival instinct. The throne he coveted was currently engulfed in flames. Adrian stood up slowly from his heavy leather chair. He did not look down at the speakerphone. He looked directly across the wide expanse of the table, locking his eyes squarely onto Reed's furious face. "I cannot accept the position," Adrian declared. His voice rang loudly and clearly across the recorded line and echoed against the glass walls of the silent room. He was publicly severing the final, desperate rope keeping the company tethered to its false reality. "I will not accept the seat of the chief executive officer within a corporate structure that remains deeply compromised by this staggering level of executive deceit," Adrian continued, driving the knife in deeply. "After the testimony just provided by the chief financial officer, I cannot in good conscience assume legal or moral liability for the survival of this administration." Adrian publicly decapitated the heavily publicized succession plan directly in front of the largest creditors in the nation. The bankers on the other end of the secure line did not ask any further questions. They immediately placed the call on an indefinite, automated hold. A highly compressed, surreal track of classical music filled the devastated boardroom, providing a bizarre, cheerful contrast to the absolute corporate slaughter that had just occurred. Everything was finally rigged to explode. The highly combustible fuel was completely spilled across the floor. The match had been forcefully struck, but the ultimate climax of the night remained tightly suspended in the heavy, exhausted air. The independent board of directors still needed to cast their final, official vote to remove the king. I still held the absolute, unilateral authority to decide whether the $2.4 billion would vanish into the ether or be aggressively redirected. The sky outside the towering glass walls was slowly bleeding from a dark purple to a bruised, violent shade of red. Dawn was arriving in Denver. The market was about to open, and the final, devastating price of their unchecked arrogance was about to be mathematically calculated to the very last cent. The sun finally crested over the sprawling glass greenhouses on the eastern edge of Denver, casting long, sharp, unforgiving rays of morning light directly into the executive boardroom. The natural illumination highlighted the deep exhaustion etched into the faces of every single person seated around the heavy mahogany table. on the massive glowing monitors mounted to the walls. The pre-market trading indicators were already flashing violent, continuous shades of red. The stock price of Ashford Atlas Grid was actively cratering, bleeding out double-digit percentages in real time before the opening bell even rang. The syndicated lenders had placed every single credit decision, every bridge loan, and every lifeline on a frozen hold, waiting with bated breath for the final, official verdict from this very room. Helena Price, the lead independent director, finally took absolute control of the fractured table. She was a woman who possessed the cold, unyielding demeanor of a financial veteran who had survived decades of brutal corporate warfare. She did not look at Reed Ashford. She looked directly at the official stenographer recording the minutes. "I am formally presenting a motion," Helena announced, her voice perfectly steady and echoing cleanly in the tense silence. "Effective immediately, we are suspending Reed Ashford from all executive duties, stripping him of all operational authority, and removing his access to the corporate treasury. Furthermore, we are initiating a comprehensive, independent special review. This review will be granted unrestricted, unredacted access to both internal corporate communications and the entirety of the financial ledgers belonging to the Ashford Civic Foundation." Reed looked completely hollowed out, his complexion the color of dirty ash, but the sheer, blinding arrogance of his dynasty refused to simply die quietly in the light. He turned his bloodshot eyes toward me, attempting one final, desperate, deeply manipulative gamble. He truly believed he could trap me in an inescapable moral dilemma. "You will not pull the capital," Reed sneered, his voice a ragged, desperate rasp that lacked any of its former baritone power. "You do not have the stomach to completely sever a $2.4 billion lifeline. Doing so would instantly terminate the microgrid expansions across the entire state. You would be personally responsible for bankrupting innocent municipal partners and destroying thousands of blue-collar union jobs across the Southwest. You are bluffing to save face. You will not let the working class burn just to satisfy a petty, personal vendetta over a ruined shirt." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical pity for a man who still did not understand how modern, aggressive capital actually functioned. I did not rely on emotional threats. I relied on airtight logistics. I reached into my leather briefcase and withdrew a freshly bound, densely packed legal dossier. It was the absolute heaviest weapon in my arsenal, forged in the dead of night while he was busy losing his empire. "I am not destroying a single job, Reed," I replied, sliding the thick, heavy document across the polished mahogany until it stopped directly in front of him. "I spent the entire night coordinating with your primary municipal partners. I have officially aligned with two massive, thoroughly vetted regional subcontractors who possess absolutely pristine compliance records and zero ties to your toxic culture. Together with a newly formed independent management team, we have fully incorporated a replacement project consortium." The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He stared at the legal seals on the cover of the dossier, the oxygen completely leaving his lungs. "The money is not disappearing from the local economy," I explained, driving the final, lethal nail into his corporate coffin. "The critical infrastructure will be built exactly as planned. The union workers will keep their contracts and feed their families. The capital is simply disappearing from your hands. I am not punishing the public. I am simply refusing to finance a corrupt dynasty that has fundamentally proven it lacks the moral and structural integrity to manage the future." The collapse of the old guard was absolute, silent, and instantaneous. The remaining loyalists on the board abandoned him in a matter of seconds. Simon Vale, looking utterly defeated but finally free from the crushing, terrifying weight of his perjury, officially submitted the comprehensive set of settlement receipts and the newly recovered, previously deleted email chains directly into the permanent board minutes. Adrian Cole, sitting with his back completely straight, publicly voiced his formal support for the immediate corporate restructuring, permanently severing his ties to the man who built him. Before the final vote commenced, I ensured that Marisol Dean was explicitly exonerated in the official record. I forced the legal team to attach the recovered digital communications, proving she was nothing more than a convenient human shield, orchestrated entirely by Vanessa Ashford to cover her own malicious tracks. Marisol would keep her pristine reputation, while the true architects of the chaos were dragged into the light. The board of directors did not hesitate for another second. They swiftly and unanimously voted to remove Reed from power. They passed a binding, irrevocable resolution permanently blocking Vanessa from holding any formal or informal role within the operational sphere of the company. Finally, they legally acknowledged, on the permanent federal record, that Ashford Atlas Grid had provided a materially false and deeply misleading picture of their internal governance during the capital negotiation phase. At exactly 4 minutes past 9 in the morning, just as the chaotic opening bell echoed across the trading floors in New York, I unscrewed the heavy brass cap of my fountain pen. With a single, fluid motion, I signed the irrevocable executive order reallocating the entirety of the $2.4 billion package to the new, independent consortium. The critical public projects would thrive. The workers would retain their livelihoods. But Ashford Atlas Grid lost its absolute lifeblood, its market dominance, and its foundational legacy in the span of a single night. The story always ends the exact same way when arrogant people forget the fundamental rules of gravity. Vanessa Ashford poured a heavy glass of wine on a stranger because she truly believed she was simply teaching someone she deemed beneath her to stand in the correct place. But by the time the sun fully illuminated the city the next morning, the unforgiving history of the financial markets had violently rearranged the seating chart. It was her own untouchable family that had been permanently put in their proper place. And the ultimate, unyielding cost of that single crystal glass of spilled wine was exactly $2.4 billion. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments section below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach and inspire even more people around the world.